Welcome to the New School. I am Alexandra Wagner, chair of the program committee of the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis, easier to remember as NPAP. I want first to express my gratitude to the colleagues from the Observatory on Latin America, OLA, and the Graduate Program for International Affairs of the Milano School at the New School for Public Engagement, particularly to Professor Margarita Gutmann and to the Dean David Scobie, whose office has provided the funds for videotaping of this event. Allow a few words about NPAP, a place of psychoanalytic formation, of a clinic devoted to psychotherapy and psychoanalysis with affordable fees, a place of research. NPAP is the oldest lay institute in the United States, with offices and consulting rooms in this very neighborhood at 40 West 13th Street. It was founded in 1948 by Theodor Reich, an Austrian exile, Freud's protege, and a man with a PhD in literature, who didn't make it into American psychoanalytic establishment of his time, as it was closed to anyone who was not an MD. Reich exchanged an unproductive struggle for the status he could not obtain with a more creative idea, a place for people like him. At this time, his project has not only more than 400 direct beneficiaries who are members and students at NPAP, but an ever-growing body of non-medical psychoanalysts elsewhere who take Freud's defense of lay analysis seriously. We invite you to our programs co-sponsored by the New School and in the coming season also by the New York University and the Cabinet magazine, and to visit the NPAP website www.npap.org. In the following months, our speakers will include John Kerr, author of A Dangerous Method, the book which has inspired recent filmic rendition of the story of Freud, Jung, and Sabina Spielrein, Judith Butler, recipient of the Oscar Sternbach Award, and the screening of the film Asylum, devoted to the work of R.D. Laing. Nothing, or I should say no one, could have provided a more interesting, if puzzling, opening to the series than Freud and Stalin in the 1940s Mexico City. Of the two men, only one could speak, read, and write Spanish. The story of this peculiar connection will be told by Rubén Gallo, author of Mexican Modernity, The Avant-Garde and the Technological Revolution, and Freud's Mexico, Into the Wilds of Psychoanalysis, published by MIT Press in 2010. Rubén Gallo is director of the program in Latin American Studies and professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Languages and Cultures at Princeton University. For Freud's Mexico, he has just received the Gradiva Award, given by the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis here in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Rubén Gallo.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you very much to the NPAP and to the New School for inviting me to talk about my research with you. And thanks to all of you for being here on a Friday night. I'm impressed that so many of you would choose to spend Friday with Stalin and Freud in Mexico, with me as a tour guide. So let me tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. This is a book, like Alexandra mentioned, I just completed. It was published last year, and it's called Freud in Mexico, Freud's Mexico. And it's actually two books. It's divided in two parts. The first part is about the readers of Freud in Mexico. I was very interested in who was reading Freud early on, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and what were people doing with these readings. And I was especially interested in readers who were lay people, not psychoanalysts or psychologists or medical doctors. And I was really thinking as I was writing this book of Elisabeth Roudinesco's history of psychoanalysis in France, where she talks about she calls it the two channels for the reception of Freud. One channel is clinical, And it's a history of all the associations and institutes and medical doctors and psychiatrists who read Freud. And then the other one is the cultural channel, as she calls it, which would be, for example, André Breton reading The Interpretation of Dreams and inventing surrealism, writing the Surrealist Manifesto out of his reading of Freud. So I was very interested in this second channel in Mexico, and I found some very surprising things. For instance, I found that one of the early readers of Freud was Frida Kahlo, and interestingly enough, I found this fascinating, the book of Freud that she latched onto was not what we might expect. It was not The Interpretation of Dreams, it was not the Three S's in the Theory of Sexuality, it was Freud's last book, Moses and Monotheism, and she decided to paint it, and this is her pictorial version of Moses. So I was very interested in tales like this. I wanted to find these cultural readings. But then the other part of the book was called Freud's Mexico, and it was about the place of Mexico in Freud's imagination. And this part I had a lot of fun with. And of course, as I was writing this book, many people said, but why would Freud, this Austrian Jewish doctor living in fin de siècle Vienna, why would he even think of Mexico? And of course, what's fascinating is that if we think of the long history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's intertwined with Mexican history since at least the 16th century. Mexico was conquered by the Spaniards under a Habsburg king, Charles V, who was also emperor of Austria-Hungary. Mexico had a Habsburg emperor, Maximilian, in the 19th century, a project that didn't have a very happy ending. And this actually happened during Freud's lifetime. So Freud was actually reminded of Mexico in his daily life through Vienna. And then, of course, I found out that he had in his collection of antiquities, he had some Mexican pieces, he had some Mexican books in his library and other indices that I found. So what I would like to share with you is it's a little research story, and it's taken from the chapter on Freud's Mexican books. And it gives you an idea of how sometimes there's two ways of looking at the history of psychoanalysis in Mexico. One, the readers of Freud in Mexico, and the other, Freud reading or thinking about Mexico could intersect sometimes. So this chapter actually started as a research challenge. And I found out as I was doing research for my book, one of my questions was, well, what about Freud's library? There has been much work done on Freud's library. Sander Gilman edited a beautiful book that's called Reading Freud Reading. And there was much interest in trying to see what Freud was reading and how that might have had an impact in his work. And the catalog of his library, which is now in Vienna, in London, at the Freud House in London, is published. It was published a few years ago by Michael Molnar and one of his colleagues. So, I went to this catalog and I tried to find out if there were any books about Mexico or related to Mexico. And interestingly enough, I found that there was one book that was actually published in Mexico in Spanish, and it was very strange. It was not something that really rang a bell. It was a book published in 1937 by Raúl Carrancay Trujillo, a name I had never heard, and it was a very seemingly obscure title about criminal law. It was called Derecho Penal Mexicano, and it was published in 1937 by Editorial Porrúa, which is a very important publishing house in Mexico City. It still exists. So, I was quite puzzled by this. I couldn't understand why Freud would have, of all the books he could have had about Mexico, this one volume about Mexican criminal law. So I decided to wait for my sabbatical. I teach at Princeton and live in New York. And when I had my next sabbatical, I went to London, Freudian slip, to look at this book and try to see if I could find out more about that history. So I went to London and I went into the library and I asked to see this book, Derecho Penal. And the librarian, Michael Molnar, said to me, well, this book is not here. It's actually in New York City. And it seemed like a very psychoanalytic twist. And then he explained to me, which is fascinating, that when Freud emigrated, when he left Vienna in 1938, just after the Anschluss, he decided to take most of his books and his library with him to London, except for about 200 volumes that he didn't really care much about, which he left behind. And these books were sold by an antiquarian to Columbia University, and they're now housed in the medical sciences campus, in the medical sciences library uptown. And it's really interesting to see what's in this group of books, because I think of it as Freud's Salon des Refusés. It's the things that he didn't want. So what do we have? We have André Breton's books. We have many, many pamphlets by Argentinian psychoanalysts who even as early as the 1930s were already discovering psychoanalysis and sending Freud some of their publications. And we have Raúl Carranca y Trujillo's Derecho Penal Parte General. So these were all the books that Freud did not want, which he left behind, which ended up at Columbia. So I came back to New York and I went to Columbia, I went to the health sciences campus, and I got the book. I was able to order it and to look for it. And I was especially interested in marginalia. You know, I wanted to see if there was a dedication, if there was some annotations by Freud, something that would give me a sense of why Freud had this book, you know, how it ended up in his library. So there was nothing. You know, the book had no inscription, no dedication, no annotations. It was even difficult to tell if Freud had really read much of it. So, well, I decided to try a different approach. So I began to make inquiries as to who this author was. Who was Raúl Carranca y Trujillo? Like I said, he's not a name that rings a bell for those who are familiar with 20th century Mexican culture. I found him quite obscure, but you know, in several histories of Mexico in the early 20th century, I was able to find enough about him. So it turns out he was a judge who was born in 1897 in the southern state of Campeche and had a quite brilliant career very young. He got a scholarship to study in Spain, where he had a doctorate in law, and then he came back to Mexico City in 1925. He actually had a brilliant career rising very quickly through the judicial system, and he was part of a generation of intellectuals right after the Mexican Revolution, which ended in 1920, who were extremely young and were able to benefit from the vacuum that was left by a civil war of 10 years, and suddenly found themselves in positions that did not correspond to their age. You know, you had 1920s Mexico was a very exciting place because everyone was young. You know, all the ministers were in their 20s and 30s, and all the people who were taking important decisions were extremely young. So he was one of them, and he became a university professor. He edited a very interesting journal that was called Criminalia, which was an avant-garde journal about criminal law, you know, where Carranca and then some of his associates were trying to look for ways to reform Mexican law and to modernize it and to bring in influences and figures from outside. So, for example, he was very interested in the work of Cesare Lombroso. He was very interested in positivism, and all of this was reflected in the journal. So it turns out in Derecho Penal, in the book that's in Freud's library, there's a little paragraph by Raúl Carranca which explains or gives us a clue as to how it might have ended up in his library. And of course, the next step after tracing this book was to read it. You know, and it was in reading it that I came across this paragraph. So Carranca presents himself as a disciple of Cesare Lombroso and a firm believer in positivism. And he defines criminology as a new science which is dependent on a series of what he called auxiliary disciplines. And these were anthropology, endocrinology, sociology, statistics, medicine, and psychology. So part of what he was trying to do, he was trying to open up the Mexican legal system, criminal law, and use all of these other auxiliary disciplines, as he called them, to modernize and bring in influences, fresh ideas into what was really probably a very stultified 19th century legal system. So, of course, of all of these disciplines, it turns out Carranca was mostly interested in criminal psychology. And he explained in this book, in Derecho Penal, that he had been an avid reader of Freud and considered Freudian writings an invaluable tool for legal work. He explained that, like forensic medicine, psychoanalysis could help lawyers and judges reach a well-founded verdict. And he was especially interested in the interpretative techniques discovered by Freud. He wrote that they could be used, quote, to analyze the criminal's psychological traits and to pinpoint the causes for his transgression, end quote. He was especially interested in the way psychoanalysis could shed light on unconscious motives. And this is something that he felt could revolutionize the way that criminal law was practiced in Mexico. Now, I began to read a little bit more about Carranca. You know, he seemed like a fascinating figure. And it turns out in his journal called Criminalia, he published a series of articles in which he experimented with ways of combining these two passions of him, criminal law and psychoanalysis. And of course, you know, the question is, it's great to say that criminal law can benefit from psychoanalysis, but how? So one of his articles, very interesting article from 1933, was called Sex and the Penal System, published in Criminalia. And it was an article about a problem that very few had dared to discuss in a Catholic country like Mexico. So it turns out Mexico, like most countries with a Napoleonic legal system, had spousal visits for inmates in prisons. But it turns out Carranca found out that these spousal visits were actually treated as a bit of a reward for good conduct. That is to say, only inmates who had good behavior, who didn't get themselves in trouble, were able to have their spouses visit them in this special cell that was made available by the prison, and they could spend the night with their spouses in this cell. And those who were not well behaved, who had some sort of problems, were punished by not having access to these spousal visits. So Carranca got very interested in this question. He didn't really think it was fair, and he decided to interview a series of inmates, you know, and talk to them about their sexual life. You can already see that he's trying to integrate Freud into his work in a very original way. So he published one of these interviews in the article. He talked to Antonio, who was a middle-class man who had spent 8 months in jail for robbery, and to Juan, who was a working-class inmate sentenced to 4 years for murder. And he asked both of them a series of questions about their sexual life and decided to transcribe their responses. And what's very interesting is that this is almost like a case study, or 2 case studies put together, that Carranca includes in this article. And it also, it's really a good window into 1930s Mexico, because you can see the clash of 2 worlds. You know, this intellectual judge interested in Freud, and then these working class prisoners who had no idea why he was talking to them about their sex life. So I'll just read you a little bit too, so you can get a sense of what he was doing. So Carranca asks the question, how do those who cannot receive spousal visits satisfy their sexual needs? Antonio, by means of onanism, and by means of the effeminate inmates in cells 56, 58, and 60. Carranca, how do these effeminate inmates make themselves recognizable to other inmates? Antonio, by their dress, their makeup, their use of pet names like La Eva, La Miss Mexico, La Brunette, La Barbara Lamar, La Onion Pillar. Carranca, how could the prison authorities help solve your sexual problems? Antonio, since I have no money and I can't pay a woman to come see me, I'd ask to be allowed to meet with a woman prisoner of my liking. I've been locked up for 8 months and I'm only 25. Whenever I go see a film, I see couples, men and women touching each other, I see love scenes on screen, and my body gets overstimulated. The way the prison is set up, I have no natural means of satisfying my sexual needs, end quote. So, you know, after doing these case studies, Carranca actually concluded his article with a passionate plea to the prison authorities, you know, telling them they should not use spousal visits as a reward, that it shouldn't be a carrot at the end of the stick. And his argument was that this was actually producing and aggravating neuroses in the prison. So, he was trying to play with some Freudian ideas, maybe in a slightly simplistic way, and saying, by not allowing these inmates to have a full sexual life, you're simply producing more problems within the prison. So he argued that spousal visits should be allowed for all prisoners. So this was in 1933. A few months later, Carranca published another article in the same journal, which explained even more his approach to Freudian technique and how he thought this could be reconciled with criminal law. So in 1934, in Criminalia, he published a very interesting article called A Judicial Experiment with Psychoanalytic Techniques. And he began by telling the story of his discovery of Freud, saying that he was very interested in how psychoanalysis and criminal law could be made to collaborate. And he offered actually a very simplistic, very simple solution. This was actually a question that had been asked before in Europe, and there were several criminologists and psychoanalysts who were interested in this question, how the two could collaborate. Most of the answers and proposals were actually theoretical. For example, the psychoanalytic notion of responsibility versus the legal definition of responsibility, and how can they be made compatible. But Carranca had a much more direct approach. So what he did is he put a couch in his office, and whenever there was a criminal who was sent to him for questioning or examination, he would ask the criminal to lie down and talk about his dreams and about his childhood and whatnot. And Carranca would listen, and then in the end he would, in his verdict, include a psychoanalytic explanation of the unconscious motives in case he was guilty. And they were all men, the people he was talking about. Or if it was not guilty, then he would also include some comments about the unconscious motives. So one of the first cases, here again he publishes a mini case study as part of the article. So in this case it was a man, a young man, who was only identified by his initials, RHV, and he was imprisoned for having shot his wife in a fit of jealousy. So interesting enough, this man who was working class, who was very suspicious of Carranca, Carranca managed to convince him to lie on the couch and talk to him. And this is how Carranca explains the process that unfolded. Quote, so this is Carranca. Following Freud's method, I decided to analyze RHV in a simple and straightforward setting. I chose to use my own professional office, sheltered from noise and people, especially in the early hours of the morning. I had R brought here, and he remained completely alone with me. In order to gain his confidence, I clearly explained my intentions, my interest in him, the way in which we were to work together. I had taken the precaution of visiting him in prison beforehand so that he would not be afraid of me. When our analytic work started, I had already obtained from him a certain degree of trust, the necessary condition for honesty. Starting with our first session, I asked R to sit facing away from me, looking at a white and empty wall. I told him he could close his eyes if he wished. At first it was a great struggle. He was reluctant to face away from me, fearing that I might play some kind of trick on him or hypnotize him, as he told me later. After explaining in detail my purpose, I told him he was completely free to move about as he wished, and even to turn around and look at me if he so desired. I thus prepared myself for being surprised in the midst of my note-taking. This last proposal persuaded him, and a good number of our sessions unfolded in this manner. Sometimes, at the most interesting point in his confessions, he would close his eyes, cover them with his hands or face away from me. We worked together for several sessions, and I attempted to glimpse into his innermost thoughts, into his subconscious, end quote. So it turns out this was one example of what Carranca did with Freud. He actually concluded the article by saying that in his view, R was guilty of the crime he was accused of killing his wife. There was no doubt about that. But he offered a number of psychoanalytic interpretations as to the unconscious motives that could have led to this crime. And the defendant actually ended up sentenced to 3 years in prison, which is probably less than he would have been if there hadn't been this psychoanalytic interpretation of what was happening in his unconscious. Now, it turns out that Carranca was very proud of these experiments, and in his article, he called himself the first judge in Mexico, and as he said, quote, and probably one of the first in the civilized legal world to have delved into the unconscious of a criminal. And you have to remember that Carranca was only 37 at the time. You know, he was very bold. He was not afraid to experiment, to do these radical techniques. And you know, one of the things that really interested me when I learned of these experiments that Carranca was doing is to think of what Freud would have thought of all this. And the article that immediately came to mind was the question, Wild Psychoanalysis, you know, the essay from 1910, in which Freud is very critical of those who practice psychoanalysis without any training, you know, perhaps just after reading a couple of texts, they get very excited by these ideas, and they end up doing a disservice to the profession, in Freud's conclusion. You know, he was very clear that this wild psychoanalysis was not something that could harm a patient, but it could harm the reputation of psychoanalysis as an institution if you had all these untrained people doing wild experiments. So of course I thought, you know, this seems like a perfect example of what Freud meant by wild psychoanalysis. He would of course been very surprised to have learned of this. But it turns out, you know, as I continued researching Criminalia, this journal, it turns out that Carranca actually wrote to Freud and sent him the articles which he had published in Criminalia, including the last one I quoted. And Freud, interestingly enough, wrote back, this is his only letter to a Mexican correspondent, by the way, and applauded Carranca for his experiments. You know, he said, you know, it's great that you're doing this. And I'll read you, it's a very short letter, it's very interesting. It's from February 13th, 1934. And Freud wrote to Carranca in response to his articles. He wrote, "Dear sir, I had the good fortune of learning to read your beautiful language in my youth." And this is true, Freud actually knew Spanish. "I was pleased to discover the interest and the appreciation you have shown towards our psychoanalysis and to learn of how you have applied it to your discipline. Unfortunately, I cannot go as far as to offer a Spanish answer, and I must ask you to accept a German response. It has always been an ideal desire, Idealwunsch, for the psychoanalyst to win two types of people over for our discipline, teachers of youth and judges." And this is fascinating. You know, this is, it's the only place that I have found where Freud makes this statement about judges. But then, of course, you know, if one thinks of it, we all want to have judges on our side. You know, we would all be very happy to that. So this letter, of course, Carranca was so excited to get this letter, you know, and this validation from Freud that he published a facsimile of the letter in Criminalia. You know, one can imagine that he had been criticized for these unorthodox experiments, but you know, here was a proof that he was on the right track. A letter from Freud himself. Now, what's very interesting is if the story of Carranca had ended here, you know, I think it would be an interesting footnote in the history of psychoanalysis. You know, maybe it would be an telling anecdote in the history of Mexican criminal law or medicine. But it turns out there would be much more afterwards. And there was another twist, which was about to happen, which would change the history of psychoanalysis and the history of Mexico and the history of many other things in the world. So as we know, Freud died in 1939, you know, after living slightly over 1 year in his new home in London. And Carranca, during this time, kept ascending in the legal system in Mexico. He had some promotions, he got more responsibilities, he became even more distinguished, and by 1939, he was named district judge of Coyoacán, which is a neighborhood in the south of Mexico City where many artists lived. Diego Rivera lived there, Frida Kahlo lived there. It was, especially back then, it was almost a little town just outside the city, more than a suburb, very quiet. And there wasn't much for Judge Carranca to do, not much crime in Coyoacán. He could devote his time to read Freud and to pursue other intellectual endeavors. This all changed on August 20th, 1940, when Carranca was sitting in his office, and suddenly the police came in with a new case that was assigned to him and that would change his life. And this was the case of Ramón Mercader, the assassin of Leon Trotsky, who had just murdered Trotsky a few doors down in Coyoacán, where Trotsky was living, and never denied that he had murdered him, but the police grabbed him, right in the act. And what was interesting is that he offered this explanation of why he had done this that was completely convoluted. First of all, he was using a pseudonym. He presented himself as a Belgian man called Jacques Mornard, and he had been using other pseudonyms, other aliases. His passport, for example, he had a Canadian passport under the name of Frank Jackson. And his declaration was that he had killed Trotsky because Trotsky had betrayed the cause. And he told the police, I'm a Trotskyite, and I came to speak to Trotsky about what we could do, and I discovered that he wanted to kill Stalin. And I discovered that he had betrayed all of us, so I killed him. This was the explanation he gave. And all of this in French, since he was claiming that he was a Belgian, so he asked for an interpreter, and no one really believed, the story. But it was an interesting case. So when Carranca got this case, first of all, he was very excited. He recognized that this would be the case of his career, probably. But he also thought this was a perfect candidate for the type of psychoanalytic legal techniques that he had been experimenting with. And he said, this is perfect. Why? Well, because we know that he killed Trotsky, there's no question about that, but we have no idea what the motive might be. And he's hiding, he's concealing the motive. So perhaps through a psychoanalytic inquiry, we can get at those secrets that he's not willing to reveal. So Carranca hired two experts. This was too much of an important case, and he did not undertake the psychoanalysis himself, but he put Mercader in the hands of two experts who were both teaching at the National University in Mexico. The first one was called Alfonso Quiroz Cuarón, who was a 30-year-old criminologist with a passion for cracking complicated mysteries. And he's a fascinating character, by the way. He's the person who cracked the identity of B. Traven, the author of the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. He cracked the identity of the Mexican version of Jack the Ripper, and he loved these cases of a hidden identity. This was his passion. And he published a book about all of these cases of cracked identity. And then the other person, so Alfonso Quiroz Cuarón was one, the other one was José Gómez Robleda, who was a forensic psychiatrist at the National University. And so the judge put the psychoanalysis of Mercader in the hands of these two experts and let them find out what they could. Mercader was not very happy about being psychoanalyzed, and he told them that, quote, I will keep my mouth closed, in French, of course, since he was Belgian. And at one point he complained that they were being very pushy, these psychoanalysts, and he said, it is as if you were trying to stick a spoon in my mouth to force things out, end quote. And now what's fascinating is they set up a schedule, since this was part of the trial, they set up a working schedule with these analysts, and it was 6 hours a day of analysis, 6 days a week, for 6 months, for a total of 942 hours with Mercader. And as one of Trotsky's biographers, Isaac Don Levine, has written, quote, "No psychological study of comparable magnitude has ever been made of a political assassin." You know, this was, and what's fascinating is that it was not only psychoanalysis. You know, these two doctors, they spent hours and hours analyzing Mercader's dreams, family relationships, childhood memories, fears, fantasies, slips of the tongue, sexual history. But they also subjected him to other tests, like Rorschach tests, word reaction experiments, handwriting analysis, and drawing exercises. And even to a host of other procedures that had nothing to do with psychology or psychoanalysis. Blood tests, motor tests, electroencephalograms, and examination of body scars. They tested his ability to disassemble and reassemble an assault weapon in the dark. They measured the time he took to put together a jigsaw puzzle. They asked him to draw his family and then interpreted the sketch as an indication of Oedipal conflict because the parents were these towering figures and he was a little boy. They administered dozens of other tests to gauge his intelligence, quantitative skills, logical abilities. And what's really interesting about this is you really see the obsession with trying to see inside of him. You know, psychoanalysis was one tool, but then there were all these other tools, even electroencephalograms, to try to see what was inside, what the secret was. And actually, I'll show you some images. This is the reconstruction of the crime scene at the Trotsky house. This is the desk where Trotsky was sitting when he was murdered. And here you see, this is a policeman, you know, who is sitting in the place where Trotsky had been sitting. And here you have Mercader, who was still bandaged because he had been hit by the bodyguards when he attacked Trotsky. And as we know, he killed Trotsky with an ice axe, you know, with this big heavy axe that is used for mountain climbing. But the police did not trust him enough to put it again in his hand, so they gave him a piece of paper instead so that he would show them. And you can see that he looks a bit nervous, the policeman. And here you have Carranca, you know, and you can see his fascination, you know, in his facial expression, you know, trying to understand how all of this transpired, you know, trying to see exactly what were the movements, where did he come from. This is a image of Judge Carranca taking the declaration of Mercader in Coyoacán. And this is fascinating. So here you can see, again, it's the reconstruction at the crime scene, except here they have switched places. And now Mercader is sitting in Trotsky's chair. And who is playing the role of the assassin? Judge Mercader, who is holding the ice axe and the coat that Mercader came into the house. And you can see how nervous Mercader looks as he sees the judge approaching him with an ice axe. And actually, I think his understanding of psychoanalysis was actually very sincere. And I think what you can see here in Mercader is that he has such an intense desire for identification. You know, he wants to understand what was in Mercader's mind when he killed Trotsky, that he's literally putting himself in the shoes and in the murder weapon of Mercader as he approaches him. Now it turns out the file of this trial is available in the Mexican archives, and it contains a host of materials and evidence and whatnot. And one of the things that you find in this file is the last text that Trotsky was working on, which was a text about the Mexican Stalinists. And this was on his desk when he was murdered, and you can see the blood stains that splattered on this page, which is very sad. And this is actually the drawing I mentioned earlier, where Mercader was asked to draw his family, and he drew this towering father and a towering mother, and then a very small child. Now, when all of this was done after the 6 months, the results of this intense analysis were published in 2 volumes, or were compiled in 2 volumes, which had the ominous title, Organic, Functional, and Social Study of the Assassin of Leon Trotsky. It was 1,332 pages, and it was divided in 2 volumes. The first was The Conscious Mind, and the second volume was an examination of his subconscious mental functions. And after this very long study, after these 1,300 pages, the conclusion was that Mercader killed Trotsky because of an active Oedipus complex. And what was fascinating was that this conclusion was picked up by the Mexico City newspapers, and no one expressed even the least bit of amazement, that this was the reason Mercader had killed Trotsky. It was just sort of reproduced everywhere as if it were self-evident. Of course, now we know what happened to Mercader. Mercader was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which he served. He was in prison from 1940 to 1960 in Mexico. When he was finally released, Mexico wanted to deport him, but there was no country to deport him to because he kept claiming he was a Belgian citizen. Belgium would not have him. By this time, we knew he was a Catalan. Spain, under Franco, would not have him. And amazingly enough, just a few weeks before he was released, of all possibilities, Czechoslovakia granted him citizenship, and he left on this Czechoslovak passport to Havana and then to Moscow, where he was received as a hero of the Soviet Union, received a medal, had a military pension, and spent his years there. He actually, what's very interesting is he had married while he was in prison, in part thanks to the reforms that Carranca had done about spousal visits. And he actually married this Mexican woman who had the name of a cabaretera called Roquelia, and left with her to the Soviet Union. And then they ended up moving to Havana, where he got a cushy position as special advisor to Fidel Castro, and died in 1978. And his ashes are in the Kuntsevo Cemetery in Moscow. Now, what's interesting about this conclusion of the Oedipus complex is that, at first it reads like a caricature. So, the psychoanalysts look into his mind, and what do they find? An Oedipus complex. Well, it turns out it's actually a pretty accurate explanation of what had happened. Because now we know, and this is fascinating because no one knew this at the time. The psychoanalysts who were involved in his study had no idea about this. But now we know that the main figure in the assassination plot was his mother, who was this fascinating woman called Caridad Mercader. And there's actually a beautiful novel that just came out last year by a Cuban novelist, Leonardo Padura, and it's called El hombre que amaba los perros, the man who loved dogs. And it's a novel about Mercader, and he has a great portrait of his mother. It turns out Caridad Mercader was actually a very rich and bored housewife in Barcelona. She was married to a rich industrialist, and she was deeply bored and depressed, probably. And at one point, when Ramon was very small, he was about 5 years old, she became a heroin addict this would have been the teens, early 20s. And apparently Ramon grew up, seeing his mother gone for 3 or 4 days and then brought back semi-conscious after these binges. And in the novel, I don't know how accurate this is, but in the novel, the novelist has little Ramon, who was 5 years old, say, "Mommy, why do you have these scars in your arms?" And the mother said, "It's because I'm very sick and the doctor has to give me injections." And apparently the family tried everything to get her out of this addiction. They sent her to clinics and they had very expensive doctors and whatnot. Nothing worked except one thing, and that's when she discovered Stalinism. And interestingly enough, actually from a psychoanalytic point of view, she became a radical Stalinist, and one of her first actions, she joined this very militant and violent faction that was working in Barcelona, and they set bombs in places and whatnot. And one of her first actions was to set up a bomb in her husband's factory, of all things, to fight the evil capitalists. But, it turns out, once she became a Stalinist, she became this convinced, this terrifying Stalinist. And we now know that the reason she plotted, or she became such an integral part of the Trotsky assassination, is because she was living with a man called Leonid Eitingon, who was actually the hired assassin that Stalin sent out to execute the most sensitive international assassinations. He had actually two names. He was called Naum Eitingon or Leonid Eitingon. And he also went by the name General Kutepov. He was responsible for several very high-profile assassinations. For example, the assassination of General Miller in Paris in 1937, the kidnapping of General Kutepov in 1930, and in 1940, the assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico. Now, if we think of it, it's actually quite edible to think that Mercader killed Trotsky because not only of his mother, but the mother's relationship with this man, who was Stalin's assassin, hired assassin. And that it was really, that's a perfect Oedipal triangle if one thinks of these three people, and of course, poor Ramon being, or perhaps not so poor, but Ramon being the one who had to pay the bill and spend the 20 years in prison. And now, something that's fascinating is that everyone who met Ramon Mercader in prison during those 20 years he was in Mexico, almost every single one has the same observation, which is that they had never seen someone who was so convinced of his own ideology that in these 20 years there were no cracks. In 20 years he did not change his story, he never repented, he never changed his mind about Stalinism or about his worldview. And when he came out, he was in exactly the same fanatical, convinced position that he was when he went in. And I think part of the explanation would be this very complicated family history where the only thing that saved his mother from death was Stalin. So he basically owed Stalin his mother's life. Now, there's one last thing that I would like to mention. And it turns out there was a very interesting relationship between Mercader on the one hand and Judge Carranca on the other. And it turns out that while Leonid Eitingon was plotting this assassination in Mexico, there was another Eitingon, working very closely to promote psychoanalysis, and that is, of course, we know, Max Eitingon, who was Freud's right hand and had financed many of the psychoanalytic journals, lived in Berlin, was president of the IPA, emigrated to Palestine in 1934, and became, a very key figure in the international dissemination of psychoanalysis. Now, it turns out there's an old question that has been put, one of the first to suggest it was Sandor Rado. And that question was, was there any relation between these two Eitingons? Max Eitingon, who was working with Freud, and Leonid, or Naum Eitingon, who was working with Stalin. They have the same name. Actually, it's transcribed in slightly different ways from the Russian, so sometimes it's with a T, sometimes it's without a T, but in Russian it looks the same. And so Rado claimed that these were relatives, and that one had chosen Freud, the other had chosen Stalin, but that perhaps they knew each other and they were even collaborating. And, as you can imagine, this was an explosive claim, that was intensely debated by historians. There's one of the most sort of intense debates I have ever seen. For example, John Ziziak and Stephen Schwartz fought it out in the pages of the New York Times and the New York Review of Books in the 80s. And there were two positions. One was, how dare you soil the name of Max Eitingon? There are no proofs. How could you say something like this? There's absolutely no evidence. And the other side will say, well, there is quite a bit of circumstantial evidence. Both had the same name. They both came from the same little town in the Ukraine called Mohilev. They were both born in the same decade, in the 19th century. And it was such a tiny town that it was impossible that they weren't some sort of relatives. So, historians have continued to debate this. Actually, some have extremes. For example, Robert Conquest thinks they were first cousins, and Alexander Etkin, who wrote a beautiful history of psychoanalysis in Russia, thinks they were brothers-in-law. And actually, Etkin has made one of the most provocative claims, And Eitingon thinks that not only were they relatives, not only did they know each other and were they aware of what they were doing, but he actually thinks that the money that Max Eitingon gave Freud had to originate from Stalin in one way or another. And it turns out their money, the Eitingon's family's money, came from a fur business, a fur export business that had offices in London, New York, and Berlin, even Paris, I think. And the claim he makes, which is actually quite recent, is that in those years, remember this was the late 1930s, early 1940s, no one could have a business exporting Soviet furs without Stalin's consent, and without an awareness and a link to the high echelons of the government. Well, there are other historians who dispute this and say, well, this is pure circumstantial evidence, it's unfair, etc., etc. It turns out, well, the debate in my mind continues. I don't think anyone has offered conclusive evidence on either side. Actually, the last book about this whole question was published just a year ago, and it's a really interesting book. It's called The Eitingons, and it's by Mary Kay Wilmer, who's the editor of the London Review of Books. And she's actually a descendant of another Eitingon who was here in New York called Moti Eitingon, who was the one running the New York operation of the fur business. So she actually went to meet with the descendants of Leonid Eitingon in Russia. She did a lot of archival research. She got family papers. And in the end, she can neither prove nor disprove the claim. So the question remains open. Were they relatives? But I think more importantly than the question, were they relatives, is, were they aware of each other? Did Max Eitingon and Leonid Eitingon know about each other, and did they have any sort of communication? And how did that go? And of course, the other question would be the money that Max gave Freud, which, if it did come from this family fur business, would have to have some connection to Stalin's Soviet Union. Now, just to conclude very quickly, earlier in the talk I mentioned Freud's essay on wild psychoanalysis. And, I was interested in the question to see if Carranca could be considered a wild analyst. It seems like he would have, but Freud did not agree. He applauded him. And it seems that in Freud's view, Carranca was wild, but not wild enough to qualify as a wild psychoanalyst. Now, during the Trotsky case, Carranca came in contact with a different type of wildness that would plague Mexico for several decades. And this would be wild Marxism. And I was very interested to think, if there is a wild psychoanalysis, what would be wild Marxism? If wild psychoanalysis refers to a superficial and imprecise knowledge of Freudian theories combined with a sloppy clinical practice, then wild Marxism would entail a vulgar understanding of Marx's writings coupled with dangerous ploys to construct a communist utopia. Stalin would be one example of a wild Marxist. And actually, Isaac Deutscher has called his doctrines, quote, a grotesque form of Leninism, end quote. Of course, other examples of wild Marxists would be Naum or Leonid Eitingon and Ramon Mercader. Now, if we think of what happened, we can see that the Trotsky case pitted Carranca, who was a wild analyst, at least in my view, against Mercader, who was a wild Marxist. And as we learned from this episode, wild psychoanalysis might raise some eyebrows, but in the end, it's ultimately harmless. In the worst of cases, it could aggravate a neurosis or chip away at the prestige of the discipline of psychoanalysis. Wild Marxism, on the other hand, left behind a bloody trail of purges, kidnappings, political assassinations, of which the Trotsky one was one of the most famous. Both Freudians and Marxists could go wild, but wild analysis, even if in most extreme forms, was merely a form of listening, while wild Marxism was almost always an instrument of murder. Analysis could also be deployed as a weapon, and actually Mercader experienced the battery of psychological tests as a form of torture, but those who found themselves on the couch of a wild analyst fared much better than those like Trotsky who found themselves in the bullseye of wild Marxism. What were the repercussions of this epic struggle between the disciplines of the disciples of Freud and Stalin in Mexico. Could we conclude that psychoanalysis triumphed over Stalinism? The efforts of Carrancá and Quirós Cuarón led to Mercader's sentence and imprisonment, while at the same time raising the prestige of psychoanalysis and exposing the dangers of Stalinism. More than 7 decades after Carrancá's efforts, analysts, it seems, are still putting Stalinists on the couch. So it seems like in this one case, Freud had the upper hand over Stalin. Now, to go back to the book that started this whole inquiry, Derecho Penal, the single Mexican book in Freud's library, we can now see had quite a story to tell. The tale of a Mexican judge who brandished psychoanalysis as a weapon against crime, invented the technique of psycholegal analysis, and counted Trotsky's assassin as his most famous subject. The plot, as complex as a detective novel, implicated Mercader, Leonid Eitingon, and even Stalin, an unlikely cast of characters in a psychoanalytic murder mystery. I was of course very interested in what would have Freud thought if he had learned, if he hadn't died in 1939, and he had gotten to hear about this entire story and episode. He would have probably thought that Mexico was a very strange place, a society ruled by enlightened, psychoanalytically inclined judges, who were putting on the couch these wild Stalinist assassins. And I think if rumors of this, if news of this place called Mexico had ever reached Freud, he would have certainly concluded with mild amusement and perhaps not without some pride that in Mexico psychoanalysis had gone completely wild. Thank you. Thank you, and I think we have time for questions and discussion. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't know if this is true or not, perhaps you can clarify it, but I read somewhere that one of the Eitingons, Mr. Leonid, developed the techniques of brainwashing in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I'm not an expert on the biography of the Eitingons, but he was in Barcelona during the Civil War, and that's actually where Caridad Mercader began her activity as a Stalinist. And there is actually a good biography of Eitingon in a book called by Sudo Platov, who was one of the agents of the GPU, later the KGB, called Special Tasks. And in it, he does talk about all the things that Eitingon was an expert at, and I can't remember the details, but he was someone who was especially trained, as was Mercader, in psychological resistance, in dealing with what could be 20 years of being in prison without breaking or revealing a secret. Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
You might be familiar with the Eisenstein film of 1930 of Mexico. Mm-hmm. Interesting film on the Stalinist approach to Mexico. Mm-hmm. Also, could you touch upon Grunwald's 1948 film Mexico Reyes Alavito, supposedly under influence of Freudian satire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I think, there's a whole book that remains to be written about the interactions between Mexico and the Soviet Union in the 20s, the teens, 20s, and 30s, probably up until this date, up until the 1940s. And of course, these were, Mexico had the revolution in 1910, 1920. Diego Rivera was very fond of telling everyone that Mexico had a revolution before Russia had a revolution. Therefore, the Mexican Revolution had primacy, at least in historical times. But I think there was a mutual fascination, both Mexicans looking at the Soviet Union after 1917, as this experiment that was similar to what had happened in Mexico, but more radical. And vice versa, there were all these Russians who came to Mexico, like Eisenstein, who were very interested in the way that a revolution could happen in a place that had all these other elements that Russia did not have. Indian cultures, pre-Columbian past, all sorts of things. So it's a mutual fascination. There are a few books, actually Masha, there's a book called In Excess, which is about Eisenstein in Mexico, by this young Russian woman called Masha. Her name escapes me. It was published about 2 years ago by Chicago, In Excess. And she touches a little bit into that. But, Eisenstein was just one of many. There were, the first Soviet ambassador to Mexico was this remarkable woman called Alexandra Kollontai, who was a feminist. She believed in free love, and she caused quite a stir with both the Catholic Church and the American Embassy with some of her declarations in Mexico. But yes. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a book coming out hopefully in 8 weeks. Being Traven. Yeah, he's part of a major conspiracy, and if you know anything about him, he's a left-wing, German-oriented, claims Walter Rathenhausen's father. I mean, real wild, insane things. And then I'm thinking Lee Harvey Oswald, who what's his real name, he's got an alias and had a great conspiracy. And why do they all, what's Mexico got that they need? And apparently it has something that they need. They've got to be there, they've got to touch base. And I think you touched it when you said Mexico was the first revolution. The permanent revolution, actually. So in a sense, it's the dream.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. What do all these people who come to Mexico, and the list is very long, D.H. Lawrence came to Mexico looking for something, Tina Modotti came to Mexico looking for something, Edward Weston, Eisenstein, the list goes on and on, up until the 50s, with William Burroughs. And, there's this long history of all of these figures, artists and writers and intellectuals, going to Mexico looking for something. Now, what's very interesting is, what happens once they get there? And I think the stories are very diverse. Some do not find what they were looking for and leave horrified, like D.H. Lawrence. He did not like what he found. Some are able to adapt themselves, like Tina Modotti, and actually reinvent themselves. Tina Modotti, all of her photographic work happened basically in Mexico. She was not really known before she came, and she didn't really photograph after she left. So there's some people who can reinvent themselves and adapt themselves to reality, and then there are all sorts of other cases. And actually what I've thought is that, Mexico in a way was like the analyst's couch for many of these people. One arrives at the analyst's couch with all sorts of fantasies and preconceived ideas, and of course what one finds is something very different. And of course the reaction, can be either, this is not what I expected, I leave, or this is interesting, it's something different, and I will stay and learn something about myself. So it's interesting, the representatives of the Belgian embassy came to meet with Mercader. They could tell that his accent, he spoke very good French, but it was not a Belgian accent. They asked him about the schools he had attended to. He named some schools which sounded like they could exist, but they did not exist in Belgium. And so they knew that he was not Jacques Mornard, that he was not Belgian, but there was nothing else to go with it. And actually the person who cracked the mystery was Quiros Cuarón, who also cracked the mystery of B. Traven. And what he did was, this was in 1950, he went to Europe for a criminology symposium, for a big congress on criminology, and he took with him the fingerprints of Mercader. And he went with those to all of the police departments in the countries which he visited, so in Germany, in France, in Belgium, I think. And then finally in Spain, he showed the police the prints, and they said, we have a match. This is Ramón Mercader. And he then published a paper explaining all of this and then showing that the identity of this man was Ramón Mercader. And it made sense. He had a police record because he had been arrested during the years of the Spanish Civil War. And he was involved with a radical group. And interestingly enough, Mercader denied this. Even when the proof was out there, published, the match with his fingerprints, he kept saying, this is wrong, I'm Jacques Mornard, I'm a Belgian, I was a Trotskyite, I killed Trotsky because he betrayed the cause. And this is what's really remarkable, it's that, someone who would not change his tune in 20 years, even as the world was changing, even as he was confronted with the evidence. He was just a very, there's something psychologically that was really tough. Yes, please.
Did Mercader ever get a chance to respond to the conclusion that he killed Trotsky because of that Oedipus complex? Did he ever write anything or say anything that wasn't it?
I think in general, I'm not aware of any specific comments that he made about that one diagnosis, but he did not take the psychoanalysis very seriously. He felt that this was an intrusion. He felt that he was forced to do it. What was very interesting is people who met him during the 20 years he was in prison. He was a model prisoner. Apparently he had perfect behavior. There was once in the 30s, in the late 40s, I'm sorry, there was a campaign that one of the Mexican presidents launched, and it was for teaching inmates to read and write. And the president said the person who wins the contest of teaching the most, the greatest number of inmates to read and write will receive a early release. And actually the person who won this was Mercader. But because he was Mercader, he was not released early. And actually, Isaac Don Levine goes into this quite a bit. Apparently he became very involved in radio. These were the years of where people studied radio circuitry. So he became like a very skillful radio, technician. And he would assemble all these radios and teach inmates to assemble radios. So he was a model prisoner, but one who would never. You could talk to him about anything. Apparently, he liked to talk about science. He liked to talk about, radios, whatnot, except his own personal history and politics. That was the one taboo. Yes.
Did Mercader come to Mexico with his family especially to kill Trotsky? When did they arrive to Mexico? Where did it develop?
Yeah, actually that's a very good question. So, this is very sad because now that we know all of the pieces of the story, which we didn't for a very long time, but now, the archives are open, we know all of this. Basically what you can see is that poor Trotsky had no chance. There was a plan A, there was a plan B, there was a plan C, there was a plan D. And if Mercader had failed, there were many other plans that were backups, and he was not going to make it. But what happened was there were 2 assassination attempts in Mexico. The first was some months earlier, and it was led by David Alfaro Siqueiros, the muralist, who was also a hardline Stalinist. And for that one, Siqueiros and a bunch of thugs dressed as policemen, and they came to the house with machine guns, and then they machine gunned the bedrooms and whatnot. And amazingly, Trotsky survived. He went under a bed, and nothing happened to him. And then there was this assassination attempt, which was successful by Mercader. And what happened was Mercader, it would make a very good spy film, because actually Mercader identified this woman who was an American socialist who was living in Paris, and she was going to go work for Trotsky as a secretary. And when she was in Paris, Mercader went to Paris, courted her, and became her boyfriend. And then she said, I have to go to Mexico, and he said, I will come with you. And he was masquerading as a Canadian businessman. He had this Canadian passport. He was, his name was Frank Jackson in this passport. And he came to Mexico, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 39, not too long before. And he spent a few months dating this woman, and through her, he became a regular presence outside the Trotsky house. So, the guards would see that he would show up to pick her up. Once or twice, he was invited in, to pick her up. So, many people ask, how could he have gotten in when there were all these bodyguards and people checking the entrance with what was a little arsenal? Because he had a coat where he was carrying the ice axe, he had a pistol and a knife. So, talk about plan A, B, C, and D. And the only reason that he wasn't searched, even though apparently the policy was to search everyone, was because he was known. He was the boyfriend of the secretary. He had been there several times. He had had tea with the Trotskys at one point. And actually, the pretense, the excuse that he used that time, he said to Trotsky, I've just written an article about the Trotskyite movement, and I would like you to look it over. So Trotsky actually went with him into the study, and while Trotsky was reading his article, looking it over, he went behind him and, hacked him with the ice axe. And what's interesting is that Trotsky survived, and apparently he screamed, such a violent scream. And Mercader always mentioned that, this scream he would never forget, that it was a scream that would rip his soul, that he would still replay in his memory. And there's actually a book that's called El Último Grito de Trotsky, the last scream of Leon Trotsky about this. What's very sad is that you can just see that, with all the resources and the power that Stalin had, there was no way, whatever Trotsky did, that he could survive. He had, one of the best funded and qualified and trained armies out to get him.
Is there any possibility that he was under some kind of delusion that he really truly was Belgian? As a follow-up to that is that how did he fit that whole story together with the fact that his mother is Spanish and all that and all that?
Yeah, well, he always denied that. He always, even when the evidence was there, I don't think Caridad Mercader came into the picture when he was still in Mexico, when all of these people were working on his case. That's something that historians discovered later. I'm almost certain about that. But, he just stuck to his story. I'm a Belgian citizen, I killed him because I was a disillusioned Trotskyite. And he wouldn't budge. There was something very firm in them. And actually there has been some work done on apparently the psychological training that he received in the Soviet Union, and about, the very, very extreme experiments that he was subject to make sure that he would, that he could keep his mouth closed for about 20 years. Yeah.
I think that people have a belief of the story that Trotsky idea of being power somehow. Trotsky was in the place of Stalin, and Stalin had to be.
So would Stalin have been murdered in Mexico City by by a Trotsky? Well, I think part of what's maybe this explains why Trotsky could have never become the head of the Soviet Union. But Trotsky was actually very interested in Freud and in psychoanalysis. He was an intellectual. He had great curiosity, and he thought, his process was a little bit like Freud's. He liked to ask questions. He liked to explore the possible answers to the questions, but he didn't really like giving quick answers, which is what Stalin liked. So, for example, Trotsky asked in several texts, he said, is psychoanalysis compatible with the revolution? Is psychoanalysis compatible with Marxism? And he had a suspicion that it was. He wasn't quite sure how that could be done. And he had a few texts in which he kind of explores the questions, but he always concluded that there was more work to be done. But he thought that fundamentally they could be. So I think this shows that he had a very different way of thinking, of looking at the world, of just looking at life than Stalin did. Stalin, didn't like complex questions, liked answers. So I think, that would perhaps explain why he could have never been the leader of the Soviet Union. He was too much of an intellectual. But, yeah? Mm-hmm.
At the time, there were other competing schools of psychoanalysis. And I'm just curious to know, when the experiment was done in the prison, and this interviewing of the prisoners, whether an approach that would be more socially conscious would not have been attractive to the judge. And I wonder whether Fromm and Fromm's ideas and examples would not have provided a tool to understand what went on as much as using the classical study of it.
Yeah, I think It's a great question. I think part of what's fascinating about this episode is that this took place before there was an institutionalized psychoanalysis in Mexico. So, the first institute, the first psychoanalytic association recognized by the International was founded in 1950. And so this was 10 years before the psychoanalysis existed as a institutionalized discipline in Mexico. Fromm came to Mexico in the decade of the 50s as well. So I think what's interesting about this episode is it's something that could only be possible precisely because the institutions were weak. All of them, the law, psychoanalysis, there was very little control, from above as to what could be done. And, one of the things that fascinates me is that this story could have never happened in France or in New York or in Germany, precisely because the institution of the law was so solid and so regulated, right? A judge would never have the leeway to say, I would like to put a couch in my office and I would like to include psychoanalytic interpretations in my very... But Mexico, because it was coming out of a revolution, because the institutions were very weak, it actually created the opportunity for these wild experiments, which were tremendously creative, and I think were utopian in many ways. And I think it goes also for psychoanalysis. It's precisely because there was no institutional psychoanalysis, there was no institute which could have come and said, what you're doing is not orthodox, or it's not Freudian enough, or where are your training certificates, that allowed these kinds of wild experiments. And I think they were pretty wild, but there's also a utopian side of them that I really like. Yeah, please.
In the conversation we had before the lecture, you mentioned that about a month ago you were in Mexico City giving a talk related to the book. Within the context, if I understood you correctly, of history of Mexican psychoanalysis seminar or conference. I would be curious to know how our colleagues in Mexico, who now have institutional support and organization, actually viewing episodes like this one. Do they find it relevant? How do they render history of psychoanalysis in Mexico?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. There were a few efforts to write a history of psychoanalysis in Mexico before my book that were done in Mexico City, but all of them were institutional histories, so they began in 1950. The point of departure was 1950, the creation of the Mexican Psychoanalytic Association, which was part of the International. And then they chronicled, when the Frommians came along, and then various splits and whatnot. And I think part of what I like about these episodes is that not only do they show us that there was a history of psychoanalysis that happened before the institution, but it also shows another way of thinking about what Freud's writings and what psychoanalysis was all about. So, for example, in this Congress, when I would talk about some of these ideas, I think there was a great fascination with this kind of prehistory of what these practicing analysts always thought. I think what I found, which was really interesting, was that many of these analysts really thought that their history only went back to 1950. And there are actually still one or two alive who were alive when that happened. And suddenly to discover that there's a prior history, almost like a much more ancient history, I think was something that really surprised people in a positive way. Okay, well, thank you very much, and we can...